Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We are consumed by an era of spin over substance. We're told one thing, and yet our eyes and other senses tell us different. And if we stop dancing to the state-sponsored tune being played, well, then we're radicals. But who are the real radicals? And what is the overarching narrative we're being expected to swallow, hook, line, and sinker? Inflation, that's been trending steeply upwards. That's apparently the fault of Putin's price hike, so they allege, while conveniently ignoring the previous 12 months of rocketing inflation. America is more respected on the world stage than ever, they say, as spokespeople and friendly politicos are forced to explain the president's meaning and insist that he didn't say what you thought he said. Add into this a woke agenda that threatens to derail the very existence of America as a constitutional republic, and it seems that truth has indeed become a rare animal. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we talk cultural Marxism, America's sinking reputation under Biden, sky-high inflation, and a whole lot more. I want to say thank you to our listeners out in Hagerstown, Maryland on WARK 1490 AM and 98.9 FM. Thank you for being here. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. If it seems like institution after institution is falling to the woke ideology, you're probably not far wrong. Whether arts and entertainment, education and healthcare, nothing seems to escape the touch of the far left. But how does it happen, and what ultimately are the solutions? We're lucky to be joined by a longtime host of this here Liberty Nation radio show and senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner, to help talk about it. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here, as always.
So let's start by putting the cards on the table. When we say woke, are we really saying cultural Marxism?
The answer is yes. It's a resounding yes, even though it's not been presented as that. It's been presented as just kind of, liberalism extended into the 21st century. But in fact, it intends to overturn the entire culture of the United States. It wants to confuse boys and girls, to mix up the genders. Facebook offers 72 different gender identities. This is a product of cultural evolution, Marxism, call it what you want. The idea is to threaten the family structure. And you look at the hypocrisy in the group, which I think we all knew was going to be unmasked, but now it has been. Patrisse Cullors, the founder of Black Lives Matter, who sent chills up and down our spines when she described herself as a trained Marxist, is now unmasked as having bought a mansion worth millions of dollars. The $90 million that Black Lives Matter attracted in 2020 in the wake of the George Floyd affair. They're under investigation for that. But
it really does seem that they're following the traditional Marxist theology then, as take the money for yourselves. Yeah.
Destroy the culture. If you destroy the culture, the politics will follow indeed. That's classic Marxism. And we see that in ways big and small, even as I wrote about on LibertyNation.com, at small repertory theaters, classic institutions in local communities. They've moved in with their agenda. They've taken classic works of art by people like Thornton Wilder and perverted it to advance their own gender-based ideology.
Well, yeah, it's funny that it's actually in the root of the radicals, I guess, from the 60s and 70s. Now, how is it that they've gone from what was really just a movement within academia, I guess, to having such pervasive power today?
Well, I think it's the persistence. The left is good at playing the long game. The long game where they realize they need to make inroads here, inroads there. They're willing to be patient. And the reason they are is because government is their God. They think, breathe, eat, pray, government, right? They eat, pray, live, government, to put it in terms of a popular book. So they're thinking about these things all the time, how to advance the revolution. And while we thought, it's interesting, Mark, because we thought there was a reaction to the 60s, which we called the me generation of the 70s, and then all the wild wealth of the 80s. But, you know, everything comes around again. And if you've lived long enough, like I have, to see the 60s and the 2020s, then you see that it's, as the biblical statement in Ecclesiastes says, there's
nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun.
Absolutely. I mean, when we hear the politicians, they talk about equity rather than equality, which, you know, is a word that was strictly reserved for the business culture up until even a decade ago. Is this really just, I guess, what people would call a dog whistle to those who know the code? So when they say we're pushing equity, fellow Marxists, they realize, oh, so this is Marxism, and they garner the support in that way. Is that how it works?
What's in a word? A lot. A lot's in a word. Think about the word people. The People's Republic of China. That ruled, that kind of rhetoric rules people. And the difference, you know, the People's Republic of China is not for the people at all, but it was presented as that, right? Equity is deliberately designed to confuse people because they see equity and they just assume, oh, they mean equality. No, they don't. Equality means equal opportunity. Equity means equal outcomes, and equal outcomes require radical social engineering. So equity means there needs to be a guarantee that a certain number of transgenders, Black people, Latinx, right? that all these, there needs to be a formula where there's guarantees of outcomes. This is the way the left does it. So equity is a very dangerous concept, but it's one that's being embraced by those who have surrendered to the Black Lives Matter fueled cultural Marxist movement. They're willing to go along with that because they think, oh, equity, that just means everybody has an equal shot. No, it means that there's an enforcement of equal outcomes. That's a huge difference.
Let's dig down that rabbit hole a little further, Tim. So with equity being equal outcomes for all, that can only happen when the state is in complete control. And if you have the state in complete control, doesn't that mean the end of democracy, or in the case of America, a constitutional republic?
Bingo. That's the whole intent. See, these people in the true cultural Marxist movement who made inroads all through the entertainment industry, all through corporate America. I mean, the degree to which Fortune 500 companies surrendered to Black Lives Matter in the summer of 2020 is frightening. They bent the knee. They gave in to the demands because, again, you talk about words, Black Lives Matter. Sounds innocent, right? And when it first really came to our attention in 2020, it was something that, well, of course, we're going to get behind Black Lives Matter because Black lives do matter. So again, people being ruled by rhetoric. Sorry if I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but I think it's an extremely important point to recognize how the left uses language to control the masses.
Tim Donner, thank you ever so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Loved it. Thanks, Mark.
Later on in the show, we talk Joe Biden and constitutional conundrums. But in just a moment, we'll be breaking down the figures on the record high inflation impacting America. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
If you've tuned into any form of media over the last few weeks, you'll have no doubt heard of Putin's price hike. the federal government salve to state that the pain at the pump and at the grocery store is solely the fault of the Russian president. But is this just the spin? Who's really to blame for the rising costs across America? Well, to help us sift fact from fiction, we're joined by economist, author, and host of Swamponomics TV, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get straight to the base here, Andrew. Is this a Putin price hike or Bidenomics 101?
Well, I think if you want to get to the root causes of today's inflationary environment, you go back
as Kamala Harris is wanting to do down at the southern border.
Or as what she recently said, we have to acknowledge.
Absolutely. Acknowledge. Let's acknowledge. All right, please continue.
Anyway, so if you want to get to the root causes of today's inflationary environment, you go back to the CARES Act under the Trump administration and the aftermath of pandemic, after the pandemic, $2.2 trillion. Then you go a year later with the American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion. You add that up, that's a lot of money being pumped into the economy. The second thing is the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve creates $8 trillion out of nowhere in a 2-year time span. That gets pumped into the financial system. But then you have the global supply chain crisis, which is exacerbating those inflationary pressures. On top of that, you have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is providing so much intensity to the food and energy prices. So I think the root causes is Bidenomics, of course, or just Swamponomics, if I can plug my TV show there,
Please do.
and all the Washington establishment policies that have occurred since the pandemic started, and then you have everything else exacerbating those issues. So it's primarily Washington policy that's contributed to this environment.
Yes, so I want to delve into this a little bit because it seems to me that the Fourth Estate in particular, they're refusing to even acknowledge that it's the wealth of Washington or swamp policies that have led to this mountain and all that as far as I can tell, this tiny little added extra bit of inflation that comes from in the recent months. So this is less than 2 months of the war in Ukraine, and yet they're focusing entirely on the war in Ukraine causing the inflation, where anybody who's looked at a graph of the rising inflation can see that it has been the policies going forward that put it in this position. So what do they hope to achieve by deflecting from the policy base and focusing on Vladimir Putin?
Well, elections coming up, you have to have that narrative heading into the midterm elections saying, we didn't have any inflation until Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But it reminds me of a lot of the debate that leftists have. When I was making charts last night, I was thinking of a conversation a lot of leftists have about OSHA and providing all these regulatory safety for workers and companies. And everyone points to, once OSHA was established, you had declining workplace injuries prior to whatever year it was established. But if you look before those years, they were already coming down. So in this case, you have inflation was already climbing a lot higher before the invasion was happening. It's just you have to have this spin. I get it. It's politics. The Democrats have to look good. The White House looks good. I guarantee you, if Trump were in office, he would have done the exact same thing. So I can't really blame them. It's just, they're devoid of reality once again. And I would say that you and I predicted this a few months ago or a couple months ago on Ellen Radio, saying this was going to be the main theme over the next several months, saying Putin's price hike. And every time there's a statement coming out talking about the inflation of the economy, it's constant. They always add that tidbit, Putin's price hike. It reminds me of that book. I forgot the name of the book now. But with Soma, it was one of those
Brave New World, Aldous Huxley.
Brave New World, yes. And they would have this brainwashing thing that background kids would sleep repeating certain phrases so it would seep into their subconscious. Today, they're doing the exact same thing by constantly every news segment, press conference statement, always have that tidbit, Putin's price hike, and then people start believing it.
I believe Aldous Huxley called it the hypnopedic solution.
There you go. Yes, there you go. Perfect.
So let's dig into the inflation numbers a little. We're looking at 8.5% now. Now, let's be fair, that's enormous. That's striking. What areas of that what areas does that most impact, though?
Okay, so first I would say, though, that the 8.5%, that's the baseline. I guarantee you that if you consider all the other factors and once you consider how they calculate the inflation, it's at least double digits. Now, when it comes to the specific numbers, everything is up across the board. The only things that fell, and I noted in my breaking news piece, was that televisions fell, audio equipment, and that's pretty much it. Everything else that people rely on heavily, bread, milk, meat, automobiles, household insurance, those things climbed enormously once again in March. And if you want to think about it too, they always say Putin's price hike, but what does household insurance have to do with Vladimir Putin? Absolutely nothing. But that was up, more than 3% once again in March. So everything is up across the board. And this is what makes this inflation environment a lot worse than the one they had in the 1980s, that this is just, it's broad-based. It's across the board. Every single thing in the economy is just rising, and it's not slowing down at all. And that's what's concerning, and then that's the debate many economists are having over the coming months. Has inflation peaked, or is it going to start, or is next month's CPI report going to be higher again?
I want to bring up the dreaded R word. Now, this is starting to be whispered cautiously in many areas. Is a recession likely?
Yeah, so that seems to be a lot of the opinions of Wall Street. Goldman Sachs, they had a research note coming out saying we've raised our recession odds to 35%. Merck Research, they put it to 1 in 3 odds. I think it was Wells Fargo, they also put it at 33%. So the recession word is being talked about a lot, as much as stagflation. Is it going to happen? If you look at the Federal Reserve money supply data, which a lot of Austrians do to determine if a recession is coming or not, you actually see the money supply increasing once again. Not to the extent as it was a few months ago, because Federal Reserve is quasi-tightening monetary policy. But overall, the odds of recession, you see, okay, so for example, a good data point happened last month when it came to consumer spending. Consumer spending actually fell 0.2%, suggesting that perhaps people are being concerned about inflation. So since the United States economy is 2/3 consumption, if consumers aren't spending as much as they were, before the inflationary crisis or in the aftermath of the pandemic, then of course you could have an economic downturn.
Yeah, another figure that I've been seen bandied around is that unemployment is under 4%, whereas inflation is over 4%, and that tends to create recessionary factors within the next within 2 years of those numbers happening. Is that something that you've heard?
Well, it's funny. There was actually another research note by another bank. My brain this morning. I'm sorry. Another bank said that okay, you have a strengthening employment market. People are going back to work, but what difference does it make if inflation is at 8.5% and all your wage gains are being erased by this inflationary pressures? So yeah, I do. A lot of people say the labor market's strong, but what difference does it make if inflation is high as it is, and then you have the recession going on, and people are likely going to lose these jobs anyway. Plus, also too with the employment, if I may add one more point about employment, is that you're still short of the pandemic employment numbers, about 2 million jobs, and then you factor in underemployment to full-time employment. All these factors add up, and the employment market, yes, on the surface it's good, but then once you dive underneath those numbers, then you see some weakness occurring.
Employment markets built on sand. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. Sunday on KBKW, 103.5 FM, 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Coming up later in the show, we talk Liberty with Scott Cosenza. But up next, we examine how Joe Biden and his administration have decimated America's international reputation. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
President Biden's reputation on the world stage is dwindling. Far from being a case of the adults are back in charge, it seems we have petulant children unwilling to take responsibility for their actions. But how does this impact American readiness? And is the world a more dangerous place with Joe Biden in the White House? Well, we're joined by former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller and author Dave Patterson to help us fathom the incredible shrinking Joe Biden. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
Great. So when Joe Biden became president, we were informed that America's reputation on the world stage would be restored. Now, let's dig into that. First, has this prognostication proved true or false?
False.
Okay, why?
Well, I think that there are two things that are in play here. First of all, when Donald Trump was the president, you could not deny that he was in charge. You may not have liked his style, and the Europeans, of course, with their genteel approach to international relations, found him boorish, I'm sure. But at the same time, they took him seriously. And when he said something, they had a pretty good idea that he was going to carry out what he said. So he was predictable. And that's an important aspect for people who are in positions of authority and responsibility. Secondly, I think that they found President Biden to be less serious. And when I say that, I think that this is indeed a Wizard of Oz moment. You have the United States, Oz, this imposing figure with smoke and bellowing. And what you find out is that it is all being run by some diminutive little fellow behind a curtain. And, you know, this is not a good look for the United States as a nuclear power. And I think that gives Europeans and the world in general pause.
Let's dive back into that then, Dave. So as a follow-up, what was the U.S. reputation under Donald Trump? You say that he was predictable in a way that he would do what he said he was going to do, which is a rarity in modern politics, certainly. And I know the international media, they were very much in concert to try and do him down. But there were no new wars. There was cooperation with North Korea, of all things, which seems to have gone by the wayside. And it seems to me that the world was a whole lot safer then under Donald Trump than it is under Joe Biden. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it was because of the fact that Donald Trump was not a conventional president, politically driven, but rather a president who was driven by his own view of the world, which was not necessarily consistent with what everyone else thought. But at the same time, as you say, you cannot deny the fact that under Donald Trump, things were much more quiet. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that people, though on the one hand believed that he was going to do what he said, on the other hand, they were somewhat afraid of the fact that he would do what he said.
Yeah, that reminds me, very recently, an old video of Donald Trump resurfaced in which he was lecturing the German government that this was about 4 years ago, saying that you're going to end up dependent on Russian oil if you go ahead with this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And at the time, that was widely poo-pooed by the American media. And just last week, Olaf Scholz, the new chancellor, said, yes, we've become too dependent upon Russian oil and energy. So, yeah, another case of another nickel in the Donald Trump was right jar, I think. So let's talk about another issue that's kind of gone under the radar, Dave. Now, Joe Biden, he's trying to reignite the Iran nuclear deal that was first brought in by President Barack Obama, then dumped by Donald Trump. What does the Biden administration hope to achieve by bringing this back?
Well, what I see is a little bit scary is the fact that, like the Obama administration, the Biden team sees this negotiation as a must-have no matter what. No matter how much we give up, no matter how bad the negotiating outcome is, their view is it's an outcome regardless. And that just isn't how you do things. I mean, unless of course you want a bad outcome, and of course, and the JCPOA back in 2015 was in fact a bad outcome.
Well, it's like walking into a car dealership and saying, this is how much I have in my bank account. Now, what kind of good deal can you do me?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and that is really a hallmark of this entire administration, Mark. They go into a negotiation and say, oh, okay, here's what we want to give up. And please, 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 won't you agree with us? Well, I mean, that's silly.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking that despite the fire and fury presently aimed at Russian President Vladimir Putin, that it's the Russians who are helping the U.S. negotiate this with Iran?
Oh, it is entirely perverse. I mean, here we are, beating up on Russia, and justifiably so, and perhaps not enough. On the other hand, we're in this ridiculous negotiating from the sideline, because of course we pulled out in 2018 of the JCPOA, so we're not an official participant, and have to rely on the Russians to negotiate effectively for us. And remember, if you look back and put your Wayback hat on, back in starting in 2013 through 2015, the 20 months of the negotiation, you had China in the negotiation with Wang Yi, foreign minister, still foreign minister, and you had Russia with Sergei Lavrov, who was foreign minister and still foreign minister. So we're right back where we started, with the same characters, and will no doubt have the same outcome.
Just as a final question here, Dave, I want to delve a little bit into the historical context, as we do have our way back hats on right now. When this deal was first being negotiated under Obama, with the help of Russia back then, isn't that the exact time when Putin annexed the Crimea region? And are we seeing the exact same thing happening now with the rest of Ukraine? And if so, why is President Biden refusing to learn from history?
Well, the answer to your first question is yes, of course it is. The Russians took over Crimea in 2014, and between 2013 and 2015, we were negotiating with the Russians for the Iran deal, and actually we were relying on the Russians to be adults in all of this, while at the same time putting sanctions on them for their mischief in Crimea and Donbass. We're right back there. This is exactly where we are again. And you talk about, the perverseness of this whole scene. We should just pull out of the JCPOA redux and say, when you guys become adults, and oh, by the way, we're going to want you to stop your terrorism and financing terrorism, and you're going to stop building your medium range and long range missiles, or we're out of it. But that won't happen.
Possibly not under this administration. Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Hey, thank you, Mark. Good to be with you.
Coming up after this short break, we're talking liberty with Scott Cosenza on all things constitutional. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
What's been happening in the realms of liberty and the Constitution? And is the US Constitution on firm ground this week amid seemingly endless attacks? Well, we're joined once again by host of the excellent Uprising podcast and constitutional attorney, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire, to find out. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Thank you, Mark. It's always a pleasure.
So, Scott, first, I want to start with this story. Oberlin College, Ohio. The appeals court has just affirmed that it's got to pay out $33 million to Gibson's Bakery for basically trying to destroy their business because of wokeness. Give us the details.
In the face of a shoplifting allegation for one of their students, instead of just letting the facts play out because of the races involved, the alleged shoplifters, and really not alleged anymore, they pled guilty, are black and the shopkeepers are white. This sort of general store in Oberlin College, Ohio, that served the university students, faculty, et cetera, was basically made to be the sine qua non of racist behavior against people by these school administrators who not only created flyers that alleged that Gibson's was currently racist and had a long history of racism, none of which was borne out by any evidence, and also encouraged those students to shop elsewhere, and then canceled university contracts with that store for baked goods and other items. So they basically tried to destroy this family-run store on the false notion that they were racially discriminating against shoppers.
Or shoplifters in this case.
Well, according to the Oberlin College
and according to the
administrators, they would say it was against shoppers. But the evidence did bear out that they were shoplifting, Mark. Those three students, the kind of person who actually had the wine bottles in his clothing, and his two Confederates who beat the Gibson's clerk when he tried to restrain that shoplifter for police, they all pled guilty, those three folks. And also in their guilty plea, announced that there was no racial animus that motivated the Gibson's store. But that, again, that wasn't, that doesn't sell many, widgets in the woke world for the college administrators.
So they have to pay out Oberlin College has to pay out 33 million. I believe that's 25 million in damages and 6 million in fees or fines.
That's exactly right. The original lower court order was for even more than that. I think it was for over 40 million.
40 million, yeah.
And that was reduced. A lot of states have reduction implementation for sort of, I don't want to use the word, I was going to use the word wild, and I talked myself off, but really huge awards that aren't necessarily commensurate with obvious damage. So in any case, it was reduced to 25 million. And the reason why this is news now is because of this appeals court ruling, which looks like they're actually going to have to pay this. It could go to the Ohio Supreme Court, but it's unlikely because no novel presentation of a legal issue is ongoing with the case. So it looks like they're really going to have to pay. And this, I think, Mark, and sort of another reason why it's very important, not just that dollar figure, what it says to other colleges and universities. We better watch our backs if we're going to jump on this woke train. We better watch what we say, because if we defame these people, it might come back to haunt us.
Now, that actually brings me on to two quick follow-up questions on this. Number one, who actually pays? The institution?
Yes, Mark, the institution will pay. The administrators are already on to other and more advanced positions in higher education.
And secondly, do you think this will actually calm down the exaggerated wokeness and hysteria that so often accompanies higher education in America nowadays?
Well, a one data point is maybe not enough to do it. I hope that it is, and it will be in certain circumstances, but maybe not broadly, but maybe one or three will, So we're getting the ball rolling here. And I think that's a healthy thing for college administrators to see.
Another issue I wanted to talk about, Scott, was this week that Joe Biden announced not only his new nominee for the ATF, but also more restrictions on what he terms and what many people term ghost guns. Give us the skinny.
These are restrictions, Mark, that candidate Joe Biden declared were not appropriate for a president to implement without an act of Congress. So it's funny. He actually admonished Kamala Harris when she suggested that the president act without congressional action on rules like this. He said something like, "Come on, we've got a constitution," which, I'll just leave that there.
He appears to have forgotten that the United States has such a wonderful document.
But apparently, once you're in power, the temptation to just use your pen, like Barack Obama famously said, to just redraft some rules was just too much for him. And so what they've done is they've changed the rules on how an American may lawfully construct a homemade firearm. As it used to be, they could buy what was called an 80% blank, which was basically a block of metal machined to 80% of the final and finished product that would be needed to be a handgun or firearm part, rather. And this legislation basically says those transactions are now going to be treated like a regular firearm transaction, requiring a full background check, et cetera. But Cody Wilson of Distributed Defense, he's a person who's often been a kind of raconteur in the face of ATF increasing regulations. He authored the original 3D printer file for an AR-15 lower, and won his battle with the federal government to be able to distribute that file. He's now come out with what I think is you could call a 0% lower. And so in other words, instead of shipping a piece of metal that had been 80% of the way machined, his company will now ship a pure virgin piece of just a block of aluminum, basically, okay, with a milling machine that the consumer then basically presses a button, and it then cuts that machine down into a homemade receiver, which they're allowed to use. So Biden's proposal and his rule implementation, that's now the law of the land unless and until a judge strikes it down as being impermissible because it wasn't passed by Congress, and we'll see about that, has been already defeated before its implementation, Mark, by this new technology or this new product and service that Mr. Wilson has out there. And he says, according to an interview posted online, that he views this new rule as an elimination of his competition because he's the only one in the marketplace who's yet developed this this way to go from a 0% finish to 100% finish.
Let's talk about the legality here of Joe Biden choosing to unilaterally change laws.
Yes,
with the stroke of a pen. As far as I'm aware, that's in this particular sphere, that's not constitutional to do so, is it? Or is that
well, if he gets away with it, is it constitutional? I mean, Donald Trump did the same thing with his bump stock regulations, let's recall. Yeah. This is a very popular, maybe popular is the wrong word. This is a way that presidents seem to be unable to avoid the temptation to try to enact new laws based not on the passage of Congress and their own signature, but just by moving a regulation.
So presumably, Scott, there are going to be some legal challenges here, but what strikes me as weird is that it doesn't seem that Congress is going to be challenging this law, seeing as it's their duty to propose and pass laws. What's going on with that?
Yes, well, sadly, the Congress and I can say without name calling, I think Democrats generally are not jealously guarding their right to make laws. The delegation of their lawmaking authority has, Republicans too, actually, they're both guilty of it on pretty wide bases. And liberty activists have long been frustrated by this because of the pace of which it allows regulations to pile up. And of course, without congressional input. So, the path for liberty is to favor congressionally made law rather than rulemaking by regulatory bodies. Mark, yeah.
Okay, and final question I want to get on to, Scott. Johnny Depp, Amber Heard.
Your favorite topic, Mark.
Why is this news? Why is this news? Why am I hearing so much about this?
Well, it's going to be a hugely covered trial because of the personal details that are going to be disclosed, and we don't bring it to the table for that, but merely the discussion of libel laws and why is this case being brought in the Virginia suburbs, for instance, right down the street from me, Mark, and it's because Virginia doesn't have what's called an anti-SLAPP lawsuit. SLAPP stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. And these are lawsuits that people bring designed to basically shut someone up, okay? Many states have what are called anti-SLAPP lawsuits. And what that involves is a kind of mini trial or hearing before the case in chief to determine whether or not this is sort of like a good faith suit within the context of defamation litigation. And it basically allows people to defend themselves without spending a boatload of money. And Virginia doesn't have one. And that's why Johnny Depp brought his lawsuit in Virginia, where Ms. Heard, the defendant and now cross-complainant, has said she's never traveled once. So if you were wondering why it's in Virginia, that's why.
Well, Scott, better you than I to follow this particular story, as it's not on my radar at all. But thank you for joining us. Much appreciated.
I know you're weak for all the celebrity litigation, Mark. That's why I brought it for you. Cheers.
And that's almost it for this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. My sincere thanks go out to our guests, Tim Donner, Andrew Moran, Dave Patterson, and Scott D. Cosenza. And of course you, the listeners, for taking the time to join us. One final thought before we wrap up. And Thomas Sowell once wrote, "When you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear." And we have platitudes from closet Marxists, politicians, and the chattering classes, all telling us what they want us to internalize, pushing the narrative that they want us to accept. The basic fact is that they're not doing this for us. They're doing it for them. The truth is often uncomfortable and controversial, and long may it always remain. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.